And welcome back, everybody. Well, at the age of 27, while in Somalia as a freelance reporter, our next guest, along with an Australian photographer, was kidnapped and held hostage by a group of Somali men for 460 days.
Since being released, she started a foundation aimed at improving education in Somalia and has written a book about her harrowing experience called A House in the Sky. Please welcome Amanda Lindhout. To have you here.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say before we even start, my father is the biggest fan of this show. And so
Really?
I have to say hi, Dad, and pass that along to all of you ladies. He was so excited that I was going to be on today.
Hi, Dad. Hi, Dad. That's great.
Okay, so let's jump into prior to August 2008. You wrote in the book about how you've always had a lifelong obsession with travel. You even considered yourself what's called a country counter, went to as many places as you could. What was it about travel that you were so drawn to?
Well, I grew up in Red Deer, Alberta, and I grew up in a poor household. We didn't have money to travel. My mom was a cashier at a grocery store making minimum wage, and so the world to me was the images that I saw on the pages of National Geographic magazine. And then as a young woman, after finishing high school and saving up a little bit of money, I found my way out into the world. And all through my early 20s, as a young woman alone, I traveled to over 50 countries on a shoestring budget, discovering really the beauty of the world.
So you're discovering the beauty of the world, you're counting countries, you're getting to 50, but Somalia was a different situation. At the time that you visited Somalia, it was one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Even seasoned war journalists and reporters were not going there. But you did go there, and you didn't have much training or a major news outlet to back you. What made you decide to head into that country?
Well, there are many things that I would do differently if I could go back in time and change things. But I was a young woman who believed in the goodness of the world, and I had transitioned from being a traveler to being a journalist, a freelance journalist. I was living in Baghdad, Iraq in 2008, and I had gone from Baghdad to Somalia for what I thought was going to be a one-week work trip. So I was as used to being in a conflict zone as it's possible to be. I'd been living in Afghanistan and Iraq, and yet Somalia was a different country. Journalist colleagues had warned me about going there. I didn't listen. And I went hoping that I would be able to shed some light on the humanitarian crisis that was unfolding and continues to unfold in that country. And obviously that's not exactly what happened.
And I mean, prior to that, you had been to, as Lainey mentioned, Afghanistan, for example, and all these places people warned you about, you ended up finding out that it was a lot less scary than people imagined. So was that part of the mindset that you were going in?
Yeah, it's true. I think I was discovering humanity behind headlines, and that people all over the world really have a lot more in common than they do differences, that people everywhere just generally want the same things, right? They want to be safe and educated and opportunities.
Amanda, take us through what happened the day you were kidnapped. You were with Nigel, an Australian photographer who was your ex-boyfriend at the time. But where were you two headed?
We were going to an internally displaced people's camp. So it was home to hundreds of thousands of people who had been pushed out of their homes because of the conflict that's unfolding in the capital city, Mogadishu. And so we were on our way to this camp, driving along a highway road, when our vehicle was ambushed by about a dozen teenage boys, the youngest of them being 14 years old, holding AK-47s. And that day we were pulled out of our vehicle and taken to an abandoned house. And that was the start of what ended up being 460 days in captivity.
When you were in captivity, was there a point that you realized exactly how severe the situation was?
You know, it took a little while to dawn on me that this was not going to be over quickly. You know, I think it's hard for the mind to comprehend, and as time went on, there were certainly moments that I felt sort of hopeless, because they were demanding a ransom of $1.5 million. As I've said, I don't come from a family that's wealthy, and the Canadian government doesn't pay ransoms. And so at times it did feel a little bit hopeless.
So if we fast forward now into that 6 months into your captivity, there was a point when you and Nigel did in fact manage to get away. You broke through a window, you got out, you sought refuge in a mosque, and then eventually your captors found you both there. And in this case, you tell us about this woman who really put her life on the line for you in this situation, trying to save you, essentially. What did she do for you, and how did that impact you?
Well, this amazing and courageous woman literally risked her life. And to be honest, I don't know today what happened to the woman, and she may have lost her life that day trying to help me. But as Nigel and I were hiding in this mosque surrounded by gunmen who wanted to take us out, this woman embraced me and called me her sister and did everything she could, pleaded and begged with my captors to let me go. And they had no patience for this woman's interference. And so I was recaptured. And the last I saw her, she was surrounded by gunmen. But her courage that day really stayed with me, it stays with me still, but particularly for the last 10.5 months that I had in captivity, because I can tell you that following that failed escape attempt, everything changed. We'd really crossed a line with our kidnappers, and everything that followed was punishment.
Well, let's talk about that, yeah, because prior to this escape attempt, it was like an escalation. It started off that Nigel and you were together, and then you were separated, then the escape attempt happened, and then it was like your captors really took things to the next level. And reading it, I mean, I just wept for you and the experiences that you were going through. How did you survive mentally during this time?
Yeah, so everybody has a sense of what I went through after that failed escape attempt. Nigel and I, after that, were taken to a new house, and I was locked up in a pitch black room with chains around my ankles. I couldn't sit up, I couldn't lie on my back, I couldn't move my body at all, and went through a long period of abuse and starvation. I mean, it was about as bad as you could imagine. And yet, I named my book A House in the Sky because what I was discovering was the mind and the imagination's amazing ability to lift you out of suffering when you need it the most. I found that no matter how bleak everything around me was, I could still close my eyes and go to this place in my mind where I could remember the beauty of the world. I could remember my family. I could think about all the things that I still hope to do with my life if I had another chance at it.
That's amazing. So both the Canadian and the Australian governments, as you alluded to, so they have a policy for not paying ransom to terrorist groups. And in this case, there was a $2 million check that they wanted, essentially, for both of you. And eventually, we know that you were freed with the work of private, it's a private security company, essentially, who sort of stepped in on behalf of the families that were involved. What do you think now when it comes to this idea of hostage situations and the fact that the governments do not pay in many cases? What are your thoughts on what's happening in the world today?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I understand why the Canadian government doesn't pay ransoms. I mean, it's to protect us as Canadian citizens as we're out in the world so that we don't become targets of kidnappings. And yet, for a family that's in that situation, I mean, how tough. It's a policy that I still support. The problem is that there's not one policy around the world. Some countries pay ransoms, some countries don't. You see in a country like Syria, hostages being released as ransoms were paid, and families like Jim Foley's family that was trying very hard to raise money for him wasn't able to do it in time, you know, and then unfortunately, you know, he lost his life. Yeah.
Amanda, let's talk about life today. I mean, on social media, you post pictures of you baking and traveling and of you with your dogs. But how does one transition back into what one might call an everyday life, I suppose, after what you've been through?
Well, it's been 5 years since I was released from captivity, and honestly, life is so beautiful now. I have been given a really rare gift. I've been given another chance at life, and I find many small gifts every day that actually stem from the horrible experience that I had. Like, I lost everything for such a long period of time that I now have the opportunity, if I choose that, to really experience the beauty of the sky. I live in Canmore now, right in the mountains, and the beauty all around me, and just the simple things like having dinner with my mom or baking cookies, you know, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that.
I understand that one of your captors messaged you on Facebook after you got home.
Yeah.
What was going through your mind when you opened that message?
Yeah, anybody can contact you on Facebook, right?
Wow.
I received a message, it was about a year after I'd been released, and it was from one of the leaders of the kidnapping. And at that point, I had started a nonprofit organization, which I continue to run, the Global Enrichment Foundation, and he was writing me to congratulate me on the good work that I was doing for the women in Somalia.
Wow.
And yeah, right, shocking. Getting that message was really upsetting. Of course, I didn't reply. I sent it on to the authorities. That was a couple of years ago, and so now I actually feel like there's some justice about that. Like the fact that they know about the choices that I've made on the other side, the fact that they know that I chose compassion over hatred and that I'm giving back to that country where I lost my freedom for a long time, there's justice in that.
Wow, your story is unbelievable. Oh, Amanda, I wish we had a full hour with you. We want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And of course, we want to tell you, pick up a copy of A House in the Sky today. A phenomenal, very difficult, but just a story of survival in here. Everyone in our studio audience, good news is you're going home with your own copy today.